Next, I will call up Colette, my friend Colette Pichon Battle. She is a native of Louisiana who lives, breathes, and dreams her community. She's widely recognized for her work around multiracial, cross-regional alliance building in the Katrina recovery and other environmental disasters, like the BP oil spill. Currently, Colette serves as the director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, managing programs focused on global migration, community economic development, climate justice, and equitable disaster recovery. She's also a lead coordinator for Gulf South Rising 2015, a regional initiative around climate justice in the South. Give it up for Colette.
Bonjour. Just checking, I was just checking. It's so great to be here. You guys look beautiful. Thank you for having me. I'll stop doing that. The first question that most folks from the Gulf Coast get when we're in places like New York is, where were you when Katrina hit? Well, I was in DC, practicing corporate law, trying to achieve success. Anybody feeling me? Any black lawyers out here moved to DC to achieve success? It's a whole bunch of success out there. It's beautiful black people, beautiful suits, nice cars. They go to museums, they eat out. It's great. It's fantastic. Best couple years of my life, loved every minute of it. And then there was this really big storm in the Gulf. I checked on my family, and the next day we saw these images, and it took about 2 weeks before I knew everybody in my family was okay. There was one thing I understood as a lawyer. They might need some help with paperwork. I'll go down, I'll volunteer. I'll go home for a little while. But what I didn't understand as a movement leader was how much injustice was located in the middle of disaster. My community has been in Slidell, Louisiana, actually just outside, since the 1770s. Our community, so says the oldest people there who gave us testimony after the storm, said the water had never been that high. We're people who live with water all the time. It had never come up that far. There's a 30-foot tidal surge off the Gulf of Mexico, and my community was completely underwater. Well, I was told I was talking to some lawyers today, so I don't have like an inspirational talk. What I did make was a list of damages, so I thought you'd appreciate that. Yeah, you know, I'm not one of those, I hate trial. I don't like speaking in front of folks. But interestingly enough, in disaster work, there's a lot of different roles for lawyers. And one of the roles I found over the last 10 years is just keeping a list of all the things that we should be receiving damages for. The first thing I want to mention is we're waiting for damages from the oil companies that dredged canals in the lower part of Louisiana and allowed for the saltwater intrusion to destroy the marshes that protect the land. I don't know how much money that'll be, but you know, if you could just restore the south of Louisiana, that'd be okay. So whatever that equals, we'll take those damages. The second damages on my list go to the federal government, because it was actually the failure of levees built by our federal government that flooded an entire city. New Orleans was 80% underwater, not because of Katrina, but because of levees that broke. And what was found out in trial was that those levees, one, were not built to the standards that they were set to, and two, the standards that were set weren't good enough to protect that city. There was a lawsuit. They even won. Turns out you can't sue the federal government for damages when the Army Corps of Engineers is at fault. The third on my list is the New Orleans Police Department. Yeah. We just want damages for all the black people they killed. And when they do the calculations for the civil part of the trial, we would appreciate if you would value black lives the way that white lives get valued when these kinds of things happen. Next on the list is the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. I don't know if you heard, but in the middle of the storm, people literally tried to leave the city, tried to run away, tried to get away from the water that was slowly rising. And there were armed sheriffs on the bridge of the Crescent City Connection telling people that they could not get out and sending them back into Orleans Parish. We would like some damages for that. I'm not sure how to calculate that. I'm willing to work with you all to figure out how that's going to break down. But something about that seems a little illegal, and I just think we have some civil claims to that. That's just a guess, just a guess. I asked my trial friends to help me with that. Next on the list is BP. Now, 5 years after we were recovering from Katrina and the levee breaches and the floods, right when people were just starting to come out of the trauma that takes on after a disaster like that, there was a massive disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. 3.1 million barrels, 300 million gallons of oil, not regular oil, heavy crude oil. And if that wasn't bad enough, BP, the federal government, several other people said, well, let's sink the oil that's floating to the top by spraying toxic dispersants on it. And let's use toxic dispersants that are banned in Europe for their human impact, for their known human impact, the cancer-causing properties of this stuff. Let's spray it on South Louisiana. And that's what they did. Recently, there was a judgment. Some people were happy about it. Most people in South Louisiana were not. The judgment was $20 billion against BP. Some people think that's a lot of money. But $20 billion is what was settled for the Alaska Exxon Valdez, an oil spill that was a fifth the size, one state, on rocky coast with no population. We would like the rest of our money. We could just multiply that and calculate it out. Finally, and I know it's nobody in this audience, but it might be some of your friends, we would like damages for all of the people who came down to South Louisiana and South Mississippi and South Alabama to exploit for their careers, their interests, their volunteer desire, who came down to exploit my people for your benefit. We would like our damages. We would like our damages. Our disaster recovery is not a game. It's not a learning moment. There's some injustices going on, and if you're not coming to help us find justice, we don't need you there. And if you came and you did a paper, or you got some kind of grant, or you wrote some sort of something or another, a movie or such, we'll take all of the profits that you got from that. Just send it on down. So, small list of damages. Maybe we can work that out. Room full of lawyers. I know we can figure out a way to work this out. These are my radical ideas, by the way, damages for things that are very clearly to be paid to us. So I made another list, because I like lists. The list of damages we're done with, we'll talk about it, but there's some changes that we'd like to make in South Louisiana and the Gulf South, and they have to do with laws. The first thing we want is to see a change in federal disaster law. Does anybody know what the federal government has to do in disaster? What does the federal government have to do in disaster? Not a damn thing. The federal government, the next time Sandy comes through, the next time something happens to your community, please know, it is a discretionary movement of the federal government to act. We don't have any law in our book that says the federal government has to come to the aid of its citizens in a disaster. And if you lived in Louisiana at the time of George Bush, and you had a Democratic governor and a Republican president, you quickly find out what decisions people make when they have the discretion. Somehow, when there's discretion, Black lives don't get valued. We're not the ones that get saved, and we weren't chosen, and we weren't valued, and we weren't saved. Next, I just want to mention this little thing called voting rights. Thought I'd mention it because when you displace millions of people at gunpoint with one-way tickets and you don't help them get back home, and then you hold elections and you say there's just no voter turnout, and then you purge the voter rolls because they just haven't been home, but there are no homes to come back to. Well, we've come to the conclusion we might need some protection of voting rights in disaster. That's our conclusion. So the conversation on voting rights that's happening right now for everybody who's working on that, be ready for when the disaster comes, because that is the hit, that is the moment when our power really gets taken away, when we're at our weakest, most traumatic space. That's when it gets taken. So let's get ready for that. The next change, let's see if y'all feeling this one. We just need a law that protects public institutions. Yeah? Let me tell you what I'm talking about. So when there's a hurricane that hits your coast and levees that flood your city, we need laws that protect the strongest buildings that are on the highest ground, that are meant to withstand wind, where even the rich people go because they're the strongest buildings in the city. That's our public housing. That was our public housing in New Orleans. It got torn down, not because it flooded, but because somebody wanted to shift the, let's say the density, I see that the density of poverty is what they said. We want to shift the density of poverty. What it actually meant is it permanently displaced thousands of people who are still not home because they were living in public housing and they were never allowed to come back to their city. We think public housing should be protected in disaster, all public institutions. And speaking of public institutions, we might want to protect our hospitals too, because we have a big hospital called Charity. It was built at the same time that our public housing was built. It's downtown New Orleans, and the only thing that flooded on it was its basement. Turns out, the whole team of medical staff that cleaned it, along with the military group that cleaned it, that got its surgery ready, turns out, when they told the government, we're ready to receive patients at Charity, the government and a few other folks put a gag order on the doctors, a gag order on the military, opened the windows, and reflooded Charity Hospital. The dollars that were supposed to go to rebuild Charity Hospital, clean it up, save the people who were stuck, went to a new facility right next door. When you come down, check it out. They could have just rebuilt Charity. They could have just cleaned it up. But Charity Hospital is a hospital for poor black people. And so they've just pushed it to the side, and they use the money, and they're starting to privatize those public dollars into those hospitals. Finally, another public institution, schools. Turns out New Orleans has become the, epicenter of the charter movement. But let me tell you what's really happening. We're seeing children who go to 4 schools in 4 years. Because a charter school really takes $300 and a signature to start. These children can't write their names, they can't add, they can't figure anything out, and there's no connection to the crime that we see in our cities. It's just their fault for not making better choices. It ought to be our fault for not protecting our children and the public institutions that they need to grow. So for housing, hospitals, and schools, let's just protect them. Let's protect them as public institutions, and let's not allow your tax dollars to go to help privatize these institutions, which is what's happening now. The next law we ought to think about, just a thought, a federal law banning racial and religious profiling. After Katrina, there were thousands of immigrants brought into our city to help with the recovery and rebuilding. When those immigrants asked for their paychecks, they were fired and they immediately lost their status. When they lost their status and they drove from their home to their work or to find more work, they were profiled for being brown. Turns out black folks in New Orleans knew all about that trick. Black men in my family been profiled all my life. And right after 9/11, our Muslim brothers and sisters started getting profiled too. A suggestion, we need a law, a federal law, that bans racial profiling. It's come up, there's discussion, some reason it can't get passed. I don't know why this isn't a priority, but when police have the right to stop you based on your skin color, that ought to be illegal. Just a suggestion. We also need some laws. I don't know which ones. Let's come up with them together. But we need some laws that actually promote an alternative economic system. It turns out that in the middle of disaster, capitalism, not the best thing. Not the best thing. Not the best thing for black lives. In fact, what we saw in South Louisiana after Katrina, because the ATMs weren't full and the banks were closed, what we saw was the barter system. We saw people actually using what they had and getting what they need. We saw people leaving what they could. I remember one day I woke up to a bag of okra in my FEMA trailer as payment for some legal services that I had done. Now, I love okra, so that was a very good payment for me. But it was a lady down the street who didn't have any money. She gave me some okra. I was hungry. It all worked out. I don't understand why these kinds of things can't be part of our conversation. And one last suggestion. And this one you might not connect immediately to Black lives, but trust me, it's connected. We need federal recognition for the United Homa Nation. The United Homa Nation is a Native American tribe in South Louisiana with 17,000 tribal roll members. They are the nation that put the red stick in the ground that we now call Baton Rouge. They exist, we know they exist. They've always existed where we are. But our federal government doesn't recognize them. The problem when the federal government doesn't recognize you and you're the largest tribe in South Louisiana is that your land that sits on a lot of oil and gas, you don't get the royalties from that. You also don't get a say in how disasters are cleaned up in your community with your tribe. We want federal recognition for the United Homa Nation, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because what we figured out in South Louisiana is that none of our struggles, none of our movements will go anywhere until we have movements and justice for our indigenous brothers and sisters. So, I'll wrap it up. I went through my list. I got a paper. We can talk about it. I like whiskey. Let's find some time. I just thought I'd give you some things to think about because the question was, if law worked for Black lives, what would the world be like? Well, this is just a suggestion on where we could start. And this is from 10 years of disaster recovery in the Gulf South. So I'm going to leave you with one request, and I'm going to let you know what's going on down in the Gulf South. The request is, remember us on August 29th. This is 10 years since Hurricane Katrina. And no matter what you hear up here in New York or over there in Ohio or way on the West Coast, no matter what you hear, don't believe that the recovery is finished. Don't believe that we're okay. Don't believe that justice has been served. That has not occurred. And if you don't believe it, we invite you down to come see for yourself. There's an initiative called Gulf South Rising, led by local black people saying, this is how we want to remember Katrina 10 years later. And those people are taken to the city, and they're asking you to join them for a march and for healing rooted in traditional arts and culture. The Gulf South Rising movement is going to build power. We're building our own infrastructure. We're building our own leaders. We're building our own financial system. That's goal number one. We invite you to join us. Goal number two is we're coming together not just to party, although there will be a party. So come on. but to come together not just to party, but specifically to heal our bodies, our minds, our relationship with one another, and our relationship to Mother Earth. We got some healing to do, and the healing is going to go down in New Orleans on August 29th. Won't y'all join us? We're also moving from this notion of resilience to resistance. Now, we do acknowledge that we are resilient people. We are. Thank you very much. When you punch me, I can come back. That's right. It's good. I can take it. Thanks. We figured that out. But stop hitting me. So we're building a movement. We're building a movement to just stop the punches. We don't need to prove anymore to the nation or to anybody else that we can take a punch. We can take a punch. Stop hitting us. Stop hurting us. Stop killing us. Don't forget about us. And so with this narrative from resilience to resistance is what we're going to be shouting on August 29th. If you can't join us, at least remember that the legacy of resistance in this nation started in the Gulf South. Thank you.